Great. Thanks, Rob. So starting off with the main discussion here, and I'll start with Brian. Where do SaaS companies run into the biggest problems? When it comes to scaling the finance infrastructure.
Yeah,
based on your experience.
Yeah, I think, well, obviously you're the last group that gets invested in, right? So you got, most businesses are really focused on, getting the product right, getting product market fit, and then, then there's investment in sales and marketing so they can go to market. And usually, finance and back office is the last thing it's invested in. And you're playing catch up in a lot of cases. And it depends on how much of a catch up you are. And, in my experience, like at SuccessFactors, when I got there in 2007, it was, oh, we want to go public like soon. And it's like, okay, so we were woefully behind on our systems. Like we were on QuickBooks, you can't go public on QuickBooks. And so you've got to figure out, like, obviously what systems you need to scale, and what kind of team you need in place to be able to do things you need to do. And it depends on where your life, where you are on the life cycle of a company, right? I always look at just trying to make sure that I invest the right amount of time and effort in making sure that I can, I always think of things as people, process, systems, and data is the way I kind of look at it. And I know Armin, has the CFO transformational stuff, a lot of the very similar concepts. And it's like, it kind of depends on the business model and what you're doing. But, I always find that you kind of, the one things you want to make sure you have in place is the right sort of team that can get the things done that you need to do. And I think a lot of people actually try to get the controller before they get an FP&A person. And really, in reality, you really need the FP&A, in my view, earlier, because that person can help drive the business and understand, again, your cash runway, your modeling and things like that, and work with the board and things like that. You can outsource a little bit of the controller side and bring that later. But you also have to have somebody at the FP&A who maybe understands a little bit of that rev rec model, because it can be complex. But I think that's where most people make the mistake of, like, oh, we need to close the books fast and do all these things. When in reality, somebody to help partner and run the business. And I think that was a learning lesson for me from early on, as we built teams. And, you have to have, it's good to have people who've been in SaaS before, because they understand how to think through the challenges and things like that. And a lot of it is growth through systems and process. Like, how do you get, more out of what you have as a system? QuickBooks just won't scale. You end up in usually one of the systems like NetSuite or Intact or, anything else like that. We're on Workday. In fact, funny story, every cloud system finance I've run. So I'm unique from that perspective. I've actually run business by design with SAP when I got acquired by that one as well. But a lot of it is like, how do you make sure that system can scale? Because you don't want to be throwing bodies at the problem. You want to be the systems and the process to be able to allow you to scale from that perspective going forward. And a lot of it's going to be, business partnering throughout the organization and understanding what's going on. I think that's a key piece of it. When you come in, you really have to make sure that you understand what's going on in the product side and R&D, what's happening in the sales and marketing function, and then how do you drive efficiency? Because that's really what we need to do in these times, is drive a lot more efficiency. And you're seeing a lot of, companies doing layoffs and things like that. And it's all about, like, how do you make sure that you can get that path to profitability? Because things do change. I mean, there's been growth at all costs again in the recent, environment about 9 months ago. And it was like this back in, 2012, and then 2013, things changed. And so you always have to kind of be able to kind of see where those things are coming from. And so I think that's kind of where my lens comes from.
Excellent. Andy, some of your thoughts here on infrastructure.
Yeah.
Finance.
Yeah. And we're really focused on the people part of the equation today in this session, I know. And I 100% agree with Brian. We need to provide in the finance function, we need to be able to provide the business modeling. It's not just financial modeling, but the business modeling through that FP&A role, as well as, the accounting function. But the key for most of us at this point is making sure we get paid. And that's going to become an increasing problem, I think, as we move forward. I was talking to a client earlier this morning. The SaaS business, they have a platform that behaves like a SaaS business, and they're pretty substantial, and north of 75 million in revenue. heading for thinking that they want to go public in the next few years, a year or two, maybe. And they're starting to see some collection issues. So we have the fortunate, at that size and scale, we have a great FP&A function, we have a great controller function, but we don't have a great credit and collection function. And so all of this depends on where you are in the process. Brian's exactly right. If you take it through the chain early on, it's underinvested, you have to add FP&A functionality. I agree, the prioritization, right on, Brian, amen. But it depends on exactly where you are in the chain. And I think if I had to give up a controller or somebody, I have also at that client a rev rec person. If I had to lose the rev rec person and get a credit collection person instead, I would probably do that trade in this environment. I'm also seeing a lot of people out there. I'm getting calls from people that I've worked with at various clients. The controller position folks are calling me and saying, the growth isn't happening as fast as I thought. I'd like to go somewhere else. Do you know about anything? I've had 2 controllers call me in the last 3 months with that question. So I think there are some of folks that are really talented, smart people. And if you're having terrific growth and you need a good controller, I know too, but I'm sure there's other folks out there. I'm just pointing out I think that's starting to happen as we're starting to see some shakeouts as businesses slowing down.
Interesting.
Awesome. Awesome. All right. Well, you guys set me up perfectly for our next poll question here, talking about some of those must-have roles and especially the different stages. So, especially seeing that a majority of our group here is in that 2 to 5 employee range, would be very curious to see here with our next question. What do you think? What role do you most need to fill at this moment? Brian, Andy, Nick, again, based on a majority of people here being in 2 to 5, what would you predict seeing as the response here?
Well, I would think in this environment, based on what I've just gleaned from these experienced professionals, I would say maybe billing and collections, maybe controller, one or the other. I would assume they have FP&A. That's, I think, pretty clear that would be the most important. You need to know you can buy a controller first, but so if I would have put my money on this one, I would say billing and collections.
Or maybe everyone's going, oh no, I need to get FP&A immediately. I got that controller too soon.
Perhaps, we'll see.
I guess it kind of depends too, because some controllers can dabble in FP&A. If you've got somebody who can do both.
Yeah.
And there are some people out there that can do that. But there's some that are just pure controllers.
All right, well, let's see what we got here. We got a decent amount of people in here that have responded. Top of the list, FP&A by quite a large margin, almost half of the people in here. And then followed by, nobody in payroll, controller and billing collection afterwards. I would be curious, there's a few of you that said other, if you guys maybe want to throw in the chat what those functions are that you guys are looking to fill next. I would just be curious.
Yeah, no, that would be helpful. I don't know.
Yeah, with that, Nick, take it away to our next question here.
Yeah, so drilling down on those excellent answers to the big picture. So what's the best way? I mean, we've already talked about prioritizing the functions, who to hire and when. But when scaling well, what are your thoughts on scaling? Depending on, then you can use your any fact pattern you think is appropriate, given the audience here. But what are some thoughts on scaling and any stories you have on not so successful scaling versus a successful scaling? Does that make sense? Brian, you want to take it away?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking through the context of, most people are in the 2 to 5 employee range, and so they're probably revenue is probably 10 million ARR kind of range would be my guess, right? And so, at this point, it's more about in this environment, because you actually even saw it too, is how much cash runway do we have, 6 to 18 months, or I don't know, right? And especially in this environment, it's who knows how long this is going to last with where valuations are, because valuations have come down, public valuations, but private as well. And fundraising in this environment is very difficult right now unless you can really show a lot of growth. And that's where, again, that piece of the FP&A really getting in there and understanding what the forecast looks like. What is it going to translate into revenue, and what is your unit economics? How are you investing your dollars is so important to understanding, ultimately what you're telling your board and your management team. And I err on the side of transparency of telling people, like, this is where we are. This is exactly just almost like if you're a public company, and telling people, like, this is where we are and this is what we need to do. And so everybody's an owner, right? And they all have stock and equity, and making sure that they can understand, where we're going and what we're trying to do is a big piece of it. You want to be able to, close the books on a fast enough basis that you can actually then react to it, right? And so, like, when I got to Upwork 18 months ago, we weren't even closing our books. I mean, we're a Series C company doing close to 100 million in revenue, and we weren't really closing our books. At that time, we were sub 100 million, but we got to a point now we're 7-day business close. But I need to have that so that I can form, like, what's going on in the business that I can then react to. And when you're a small team, it's hard. You've got to figure out, again, how fast can you close? Like, there's a lot of tools out there that you can use, like a Flowcast or whatever, that will help you streamline your close processes and rethinking it. But I think, thinking about where you need to invest and make sure that you can give the business what they need and the insights that they need quick enough to make reactions to this. And then it's just like more, you can't be perfect. You've got to be directionally correct or accurate. Like, this is the range I can see. And I think there is, a lot of stuff that you've also, other people flag that you need contracting and legal. Like, you do need that support because you want to make sure that your contracts are up to snuff. And you need to Andy's point, like, you need billing and collection to be like money. Like, it needs to be something, because the cash flow in the business is so important to understanding what's going on. So making sure that you have strong DSOs and working capital and things like that, and understanding where you're investing is where I tend to go. And you can get some utility players to play multiple roles. Mm-hmm. And when you're small, you might not, if you're 2 to 5, you're probably not doing like a lot of what I'm doing, which is how do I, integrate our systems together more efficiently, because that comes later. Because once you get that integration point, you're humming on a lot of different things. And my guess is a lot of people are on, maybe on NetSuite, maybe on Intacct, but probably a lot of these companies are on QuickBooks, right? And QuickBooks at a point doesn't scale. But you're probably also managing a lot through Excel or Google Sheets or whatever, and that's fine at this stage because you're going to grow up at some point in time. And I always think about, looking 3 to 5 years out, like, what does the organization need to look like, and what do my systems need to look like, and how do I gradually build to that so that I don't get too far ahead of myself.
And a follow up to that would be, and then we'll go to your answer, Andy. In terms of outsourcing, what do you typically see is where it makes the most sense to outsource, and then overall, does that fall off as the company grows, or does it expand? And so, I mean, of course, the answer depends. But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I've outsourced in a lot of different ways. It's funny because at SuccessFactors, we actually had a lot of people in Manila who low cost geography that did a bunch of stuff for us. Actually, they did even FP&A for us a little bit, but did a lot of the back office stuff. So that was that model. Similarly, actually at Upwork, we were the largest online marketplace for talent for freelancers, and we actually used a ton of freelancers in our business. And it was one of those funny things because my team when I got there was like, we can't use freelancers. I'm like, yeah, you're going to have to learn how to do it. It's our product, right? Drink our own champagne. And so over time, people realized that they could, take a data set of some sort and then monetize it or whatever, and then send it over to the Ukraine. And overnight it would come back, matched. They'd be like, wow, that really, made me scale. So we use a lot of that at Upwork. And then, I have actually seen in other businesses where you can use, third parties to be sort of your back office operations, doing, some of the accounting tasks and things like that. That I've always been a fan of, like trying to find where you can leverage low cost geographies and things like that. But I've seen it in a lot of different models, and it just kind of depends on the business. I was consulting with a business that basically does that. They have a very small in-house team, and they have a team that basically they own the, I think they're on Intact. Yeah, they own the Intact relationship, and then they manage all of the close processes, and they work across multiple clients.
Great, thanks, Brian. Andy, thoughts on this subject?
Yeah, I think I keep coming back to, the importance of the FP&A role. I hired a guy and at one point in the recurring revenue business, and the role had been open for a bit, and ended up being 7 months between having somebody in that role. So I was doing, covering that for a long period of time, and I got kind of desperate and hired a guy eventually, and he was the wrong fit, and it just didn't work. And I followed the rules, and after 4 months I said, this just isn't working. And I noticed that one of the FP&A staff members was pretty good, but very, very, very introverted, very quiet. And so decided to promote her, and after some consultation, got her in the role, and she did a fantastic job and has gone on to do great things. Still, I'm not going to change her personality. She's still introverted, but also learned and coached her to be able to do presentations and come forward with her ideas in some format, maybe after the meeting with emails or whatever. But my conclusion out of that was, let's not worry about, the experience. Let's not worry about the number of years in this thing. Let's find the smartest person I can find. And I just hired a controller with a client. And we brought a controller into the job. Not a fantastic finance background, but probably the smartest person in town. And in 3 months, she has picked up everything and is closing the books, now, knows what to do, how to do it. Still doesn't necessarily understand all the accounting rules. So I'm giving some coaching there on some things, but within the constraints of her business, she's figured it out. So I think the message is, if you're looking for good FP&A talent, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to have somebody who has SaaS experience.
Okay.
You might hire somebody, as a great, MBA student right out of school, got a 4.0 average and doesn't know how to spell SaaS. But if they're the smartest person that you can find, you can teach them the SaaS stuff pretty quickly. I think, but Brian probably back me up on this. It's math, and it's not even sophisticated math. It's pretty much multiplication and a little bit of division with the addition and subtraction. It's not much more than that. So, we're thinking about that as you try to recruit people. We should be seeing, I think, more people with SaaS experience come on the market.
Mm-hmm.
If you can't find, if you got that person and you got somebody who's really smart and clearly, has a proven ability to learn new things and doesn't necessarily come from a SaaS background, my counsel is take the smart one and help them figure it out.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think one of the interesting things when I was leaving, I was in more software, and I interviewed at a biotech, and the CFO looked at me and she says, "You have no biotech experience." I said, "Accounting's accounting." I mean, I know how to do what I need to do, and it was a learning curve, but it was like the same thing in SaaS. If you get somebody super smart, and like I said, hiring athletes, utility players, people who can do multiple things is super important. Like, people that aren't phased by this is the people you need that will just roll with the changes. Yep. And I hired actually somebody who was I think her neurological something or other degree out of like Nebraska. And she was a billing and collection person, but she's moved on to basically being like that person who connects all the systems together, and you move into IT and stuff. And so she's just very smart. Like, you can hire engineers. I've hired engineers into accounting because they get how to connect all the systems together and things like that. And so you have to think about value adds versus culture fit type of thing. I was looking, can I get somebody who's value add versus somebody who fits in the organization.
So Andy, if you could go back to that the hire that didn't work out, is there anything you could have done differently back then? I mean, I know you were busy, and is it really something that you could have done differently, or was it just bad luck?
Well, no, it was my spidey sense was saying don't, but
Okay.
I was getting, the CEO and the COO were saying, you need an FP&A person because
Mhm.
you're not doing, you're not producing all the reports we need and all the information we need, and you've got to fill that role. And looked was okay on paper, and I thought, well, I'll make this work. And it just didn't. It was, I knew it wasn't gonna, but I didn't want to tell myself that, because I felt, this is the first real candidate we'd had, and it was just it was a tough environment for hiring and so on. So my advice and counsel is, if you have okay players that maybe you look a little weak on paper, or something's telling you don't hire them, just keep going, suffer, find somebody else, find the next smart, find a bright person that's willing to work hard instead, and move on. That's the lesson learned for me out of that one. So I hope that lands on some other people, and they don't have to make the same mistake.
Great. So it looks like we have a question in the chat. Not sure if this is how and who do you suggest monitors cost of cloud providers? Amazon, Snowflake, etc. These are large costs of SaaS and very sophisticated cost of pricing models.
Yeah, I mean, I've been through this multiple times, where we've owned our own data centers and had to move to cloud. We went cloud native from that perspective, and so it's you've got to understand. I mean, AWS's pricing model is not the easiest to understand. They were reserved instances and all kinds of stuff that you come at you. And so you have to kind of look at Google, Microsoft Azure, and everything else. And part of it is also understanding what partnerships you might have. And so mostly give it and get, because sometimes like Google will give you a bunch of credits if you're actually using Google today, or Microsoft or whatever. So there's that give and get kind of thing, a balance of trade, I would call it, I guess. But you do have to understand, and you need somebody actually that you can plug into that organization who's super sophisticated on metrics and understands capacity. We had this instance at Upwork where all of a sudden my cogs went out of whack, and I was like, what's going on? And we found out that basically their engineers were just spinning up instances freely. We didn't have anybody managing capacity. And so we had to stop, we had to like freeze, let's get this, in line. And so we basically hired somebody to come in who their job was just to manage all these things, all these relationships, and work really closely with the FP&A department to understand, where the levers were, what was going to cause us to go over. Could we take a reserved instance? Could we take a discount? We're going to grow into it, all of those things. And so I think you need somebody in FP&A who's smart enough to challenge, but you need somebody actually in the engineering organization that can sit on that step and really, really know and understand it, and pull those levers.
I'd back that up 100%. And I'd also comment, in two organizations I've been involved with, the engineering group, we've gone back to the engineering group, and I found somebody in the engineering group to own the pricing model, and who gets instances and how these get spun up and who has permission, and kind of act as the cost controller / FP&A analyst around the function. I mean, literally, I outsourced the work internally to the engineering function. Remember, engineers and accountants have a very similar, if you've done the brain studies, we're partners in crime. I mean, we think of things the same way. Some of the engineers I've worked with are better at this than some of the great accountants that I've known. I mean, they really will drive into it because they also understand the engineering side. And if you just say, look, this cost is out of control. Oh, well, I want to get into the cost. You find somebody in the engineering function who says that, let them go do it. Work with them and outsource it to the engineering group.
Because the math is so simple, right? And engineers are typically pretty advanced in math, and this is like
who built
piece of
NetSuite?
cake.
Who built NetSuite? It was a bunch of. Now I'll admit, Intact was built by accountants, but I know factually, I've talked to the founders of NetSuite. I worked with them closely back in the day. They came to the office and we had a good time. But it was built by a bunch of engineers. And they had to understand accounting to do it. And they were describing accounting to me. And it was funny at times, but they got it. They understood it. And it's not rocket science, it's accounting.
Yeah.
So.
All right. Well, want to keep us moving along here. Love the conversation we got going on so far. Had a lot of our questions that we sought out to answer here in terms of building teams and what to look for in the team members. I love the piece about, you find the smartest guy in the room, right? they're going to figure it out eventually. So we're going to hop into another topic here. But before we do that, I have a poll question to kick us off here. We're going to get into what it's like to manage and build teams with limited resources. So just a very general question. We want to get a feel from you guys. Do you feel like resources are spread thin in your organization today?
100%.
Quick answers. 100% yes.
Resounding yes.
All right, I'll just give it another few seconds here. Again, I'm sure most don't have to think about the response to this. Well, either, yes or no. I'm sure everybody can answer pretty quickly. So give it 3 more seconds here, 2 and 1, and let's take a look. Brian nailed it. All right, Nick, I know we've got a couple questions to address here again about managing and building teams with limited resources. So why don't you go ahead and take it away?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so this has been great. One, our next area, how to manage, build a team with limited resources. And I know we've touched on this quite a bit actually, but what are some thoughts around, how do you know when it's time to freeze or even downsize? Ryan, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, in most cases, like I said, when I opened is you invest in G&A late, right? And so you're kind of playing catch up to some extent. For me, it's always like, again, what is your 3-year roadmap? This is where I need to be in 3 years, assuming what the growth in the business is, and backing up to that and sort of planning for that in light of that. And in the short term, it's like, what are my core priorities and focus areas that I need to be focused on? And with the size of team, this is what I can deliver. And making sure that, I'm hiring the smartest people, or people are smarter than me. They're all smarter than me. I mean, I all work for them basically. And you get, unique people who understand. And for me, like what I found is actually I've hired people repetitively different companies because we've worked together. We know each other really well and we can click pretty quickly. So obviously, being able to get in there and hire people that you've worked with before is always beneficial if you can bring them over. And so, it's more just like, what are you trying to focus on? What are you trying to prioritize, and how are you going to get there? And then you're just chunking it off smaller, because what I found with my team, like even at MX, is like they felt like they were treading water, like getting the audit done. Like they had 2 years worth of audits and a 606 adoption. And like, we're getting nowhere. And I'm like, guys, we are getting somewhere. And it was a big win once we got there, but getting and celebrating those little, successes along the way, and understanding that, yes, we are making progress. It's just slow progress. And then there'll be a monumental type of thing, is huge. And I think it's one of those where, if you have to downsize, it's based upon the business model. If the business isn't bringing things in, then you have to adjust. And I always want my team to be as efficient as it can be. And a lot of that is having whatever key metrics I need to track. How am I doing on DSOs? How am I doing on days to close? How many material weaknesses do I have to remediate? What kind of cross-functional things do I need to do? Again, when you're smaller, it's hard because you're trying to use the process and systems to scale. And a lot of them may require a different department that you have to partner with, but building those relationships and understanding that you have a data source and I have a data source and this person has a data source, like how do we get one common master, right? That's always a challenge because teams will buy in silos. And the more that the accounting team can be involved in that kind of like, what does the IT infrastructure look like, really helps, because otherwise you end up with multiple systems that don't talk to each other. People have different systems to do. So that's a big focus item that I've always had. And most of the companies I've been in have been a little bit bigger than the 2 to 5, in the smaller range. And so I've been later stage, but I know that, a lot of the challenges are just getting the basic building blocks in place, and figuring a way to balance your team out. Larger companies I've been at, we've used closed management tools to actually understand where the allocation of work was. For like, okay, day 1, day 2, day 3, like this is what this person, and then you can manipulate it in such a way that you're balancing the workload or changing the days to close.
Yeah, that'd be very helpful.
Yeah, this thing about knowing when to reduce and how to reduce, if you're facing a 6-month cash, 6 months of cash left, there are some other considerations that start to kick in, and you should probably start thinking about getting help, outside that, staff supplement type help, to deal with specific issues around that. There's considerations, and we have a practice here at Armanino does corporate finance and restructuring. We're happy to step in when before things get to the, hey, we've got enough cash for the final payroll stage. We'd like to get there sooner than that, because we can, when there's still time to pivot and react and do some things. And along those lines, one of the things thinking about in terms of overall headcount and in looking at the financial model, the business model that you're dealing with, what I see over and over again in these situations is kind of technical founders who love having a lot of engineers around building stuff, and not as many salespeople as would be necessary to sell the thing that has been built. So one of the ratios I'm coming up with, I just came up with this a week or two ago, and I'm testing it with some folks, and you guys might try this and see if it works, is the ratio of salespeople to engineers. And I'm suggesting that if you have a ratio that's less than 1, so in other words, if you have 50 engineers and 50 salespeople and 50 engineers, your ratio is 1.0. If you have 100 salespeople and 50 engineers, your ratio is obviously 2.0. If you have a ratio of less than 1, might be typical, I would say, and might be something that you should be focused on thinking about, and start giving some consideration to. Technical founders, everyone reverts to doing what they know when times get tough. So what engineers will do, what technical founders will do, is try to keep the engineers around them close, and they're very slow to terminate or reduce the engineering function, when in fact that may be the thing that allows you to survive. It's the hardest thing that they will do. They'll fire salespeople right and left that aren't performing, but getting them to fire one engineer, I mean, it's just, I've seen this over and over and over again.
That's interesting.
And the other thing I see is people, very hesitant to hire salespeople when times get tough, and they're like, I'm like, no, if you get sales, you'll have, that's the best source of cash is not VC funding, it's customers paying you. So by far, I don't know, Brian, do you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing too is that you can get access to a lot of different metrics, as you said, and how investors look at it. There's a data set, OpenView has a data set you can get your hands on. And so the more that you can get benchmarking, I'm on a few different like CFO groups that will share data, right? And get like a benchmark. Like I got a benchmark recently of headcount by different departments and different sizes. And I was able to kind of look at that and kind of compare it against ours. I also use sometimes I have bankers, because we're a bit larger. I'll get Goldman and Bank of America, whoever, give me their data sets on IPOs, minus 2 years, like how big were they? What were their metrics on COGS? What was their sales and marketing as a percentage? All this is good data because you're kind of just right sizing what your organization could look like. Now, there's always differences. There's some outliers in the data, but understanding the outside data, getting access to it is super important, because that's how your investors will look at it. They'll come back and say, you're inefficient, and look at this metric Andy just mentioned. Yeah,
no, that's very excellent advice. Let's look at some of these specific questions first. I think I have one from Steve Bird. Can you tell us your best practices or your best practice with respect to data rooms? particularly in a fundraising environment. Who wants to take that one? I don't know if you see that either. It's in my Q&A pop-up, but so the question is, can you tell us your best practice with respect to data rooms, particularly in a fundraising environment?
Yeah, I mean, you're talking like not data warehouse, but data rooms. So usually you can, I mean, if you use like Carta as a cap table, they have some stuff in data rooms you could probably use. Sometimes your attorneys have access to data room stuff, or, you know, even like, you know, the printers like our Donnelly will tell you, you know, have virtual data rooms you can get access to and things like that. So I mean, there's different ways you can get after it. But I think, you know, ultimately structuring it like we do is mostly Google Docs and things like that. So how do we structure everything within Google Docs and, you know, parse it off so that it's not everybody has access to it. So that's how we typically have done most of it is within Google Docs itself. And then, you know, you can use Carta a little bit in that perspective. And then it just depends, like if you get into M&A transactions, you will usually move into more of like a law firm type of thing or into a Donnelly from that perspective. But typically I would say it's mostly Google Docs.
Yeah, and if the question is about the content of the data room and getting that set, I would I don't know if it's about mechanics of the data room kind of thing we just heard about, or if it's the content of the data room. But if it's more on the content side, we're thinking about trying to help people with a service that's kind of called M&A ready. And I think if this sounds interesting, you know, give us a shout, because we haven't even, we're just talking about it a week ago. We just started talking about it. But if it's an interesting topic, you know, we'd be happy to jump in and help out a bit, because we think there's a good, I think we think it might be a good idea to kind of be M&A ready all the time. And rather than rushing to get all the information into a data room at the last minute when you're scrambling to do that and do your regular job and, you know, keep everybody at home happy and all that stuff, we think it might make more sense to just be M&A ready all the time, just in case. And it helps you when we come to a financing round. If somebody says, you know, hey, I'm interested in investing $100 million in your business, be nice to be ready ahead of time for those kinds of things rather than scrambling. So there's a standard list of M&A things that are required, you know, sample copy of contract, job descriptions, information about financing rounds, cap table. All that stuff is available if you just search, you know, Google search on, you know, what do I have? But, you know, if the question about content, go do a Google search and start collecting that stuff and putting it somewhere. It doesn't have to be in a data room, but somewhere in a box or Dropbox or whatever, Google Drive, wherever you keep those things. And then when the time comes to have an M&A discussion, if it comes, you're ready. Why not be ready ahead of time? Or give us a call if you want us to help you. We'd be happy to do that.
Yeah, then switching to our last topic here, moving on, systems and processes. So based on your background, what are some of the best practices when implementing those systems and processes?
Yeah, so first, since we're kind of in the routine here, you know, I think one is knowing what your requirements are. I mean, NetSuite and Intact have come a very, very long way from what they were, you know, 15 years ago or so, first implemented them, you know. And so I think there's a question for can you get everything out of those systems that you need, or do you need a best of breed landscape, right? And I've seen kind of both work out. And so in the early days, like NetSuite was really horrible on T&E, but there's a lot of really cool systems you can use today, like Trip Actions and a bunch of different stuff, you know. And so you can supplement with other systems that automatically integrate in. So I think the environments have changed a lot. So you have to think about like how much you're going to spend, what's your total cost of ownership to these systems, right? Because like in some cases you buy the systems, but you got to have people who maintain them, because you're constantly testing upgrades and understanding what's going on. Integrations is another piece of it. And so understanding, like going in, like the early days, I felt like, okay, well, I got what the system cost was, but I really didn't get what all the maintenance was going to be of the system, as well as what all the integration. So I really want to understand like total cost of ownership and where are they going to integrate, where are they going to point. And I think a lot of it too is you don't want to customize the heck out of these systems. I mean, if you customize them, they're hard to maintain. You've got to get them a little bit out of the box, and move them in such a way that you can understand the billing, the collections, the rev rec piece of it, which really tends to be the big piece of it. If you're international, you've got to understand how to consolidate a lot of that. That's another area that was a challenge when I was at Success Factors, when we had about 30 legal entities, we were consolidating them into one world. But those tend to be the big places because the GL and all that stuff is going to take care of itself. And then you have to understand, like, is it good enough on procure to pay, or do you need a dedicated system on that? Most of what I understand in looking at the people on this is that probably not yet. It was one of the things later. But having that lens and looking at it that perspective, in even talking to Army, NATO again as a partner to sort of like or just network across the different companies. Like, what are you seeing? How are you using this? What are you doing here? Getting a lot of that information really helps you understand this lens. I ran the PMO at Success Factors. I was a controller that took them public, and for 4 years I ran the PMO, which was basically this. It was all about how do we scale our systems, because we'd grown up in a siloed world, and I was feeling the pain. And so I basically had an initiative for 2 years where we were just basically trying to get efficiency, and then we got by SAP. So that's why I ended up basically implementing SAP Cloud's products at Success Factors. And so I've seen this many, many times. That I think the other piece of it is, what's your data warehouse look like? Where is your data coming from? Most of it's going to be coming from the engineering side. So how do you make sure you can get that data in the right way into the accounting side and translate it? And sometimes you need to have what I call a glue guy, a glue person who understands the accounting and the engineering speak and can talk that language to get the data you need, efficiency, so that you can get a little bit more scale from that perspective. Because data warehousing and understanding where all your data is, what your key metrics are, and what Domo, Tableau, whatever tool you're going to use to look at those things are key as well.
All right. Well, don't want to cut off the conversation too early, but we are here 5 minutes left in the hour. So maybe if we could just get 30 seconds to a minute from both Andy and Brian, just kind of big takeaway for people leaving here today. If there's one thing they should remember going home, what is it? Andy, go for it.
Sure. I think the notion that you have to do everything yourself and or with your team, that your resources are limited in that way. I guess I would encourage the folks on this call to think outside the box a little bit. I talked about having engineers doing the AWS FP&A controller work. If there's something that's temporary, can you hire a supplemental staff to do the work for a while until you scale? So you pay them by the hour rather than paying for the whole drink. Just think, don't constrain yourself to, oh, I have a need, therefore I must go hire somebody to fill this role. I think that's the message I would send is think outside the box a little.
I think to add on to that, it's hard when you're super busy, like you can get really into the day-to-day and not see the bigger picture. And one of the things you need to have is a vision. What is your vision for where you, like I said, I always look at like, what is your longer term, 3 to 5, whatever. And you got to take a step back sometimes and think like, okay, so where do I want to go and have a vision, because otherwise you're just going to cycle.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people obviously join this webinar for that very reason. You're learning to network and ask questions and learn from other people, and that's helpful. So having a vision, being able to ask other people, test your assumptions, things like that is super, super key to the point of how do you scale and get through this.
Excellent.